Welcome to the Hidden Podcast, where we simplify cybersecurity and all things tech for those of you who, like me, need it to be explained without all the jargon. So if you've ever wondered why you still feel vulnerable even though you've bought all the fancy tools, you've come to the right place. I'm your host, Lynn, and my job is to take one of our resident experts and help them translate their cyber expertise into plain English. This means having practical conversations, usually built around Babbel's hidden cybersecurity framework, which we break down in the show. Or sometimes we'll take a hot topic in the tech industry, like a major breach or a new legislation, and we'll explain how we help you stay ahead. Basically, this podcast exists so that you can sleep well at night, preferably not during the podcast. Joining me in the virtual studio today is Anton Davies. Hi, Anton. Thanks for joining us.
Hi. No worries at all. I'm glad to be here.
Before we dive in, do you mind telling our friends listening or watching out there a bit about yourself in terms of what you do and where you live?
Yeah, so I'm what we refer to as a senior solutions engineer for Babbel. A job really is being the conduit between account management and the customers. So being the voice of the customers, essentially, to look at product, services, solutions that fit their need. You know, I'm there to consult on their requirements. If the customer needs anything, they can reach out to me either directly or via their account manager, and I'll work with them to look at finding a solution that fixes their problems, basically.
Nice. Very solution oriented. So do you mind telling us what you like most about what you do?
Well, like most, it's being a problem solver. I really like to get into the depth of issues with customers and understand what their challenges are, what keeps them up at night. And ultimately, you know, I get my kicks from resolving those issues in whichever way, shape or form I can. That's really the buzz for me, is just to help people and help customers. I'm like that inside work and outside work, so it works for me.
Love that. Thanks for sharing, Anton. All right, so today we're unpacking why identity is the new perimeter in cybersecurity. Now, that statement was laced with technical terms. Do you mind explaining what identity and perimeter mean in this context?
Perimeters and things like that, we tend to think of things like firewalls and areas of entry that people might come in from a network perspective. And those are kind of the traditional way of thinking about security. But identity really is the new way of thinking about your security in terms of your attack surface layer and the way that people might get into your business. And identity is really anything that is driven by humans. We have pretty much an identity across the board on the internet, or whichever way, shape or form. You know, it could be from LinkedIn, it could be from various different things that we're involved in. And ultimately, we need to be making sure that we're doing our due diligence to secure that way of entry. And that be way of education, extra facilities to be put in place to protect it. But yeah, that's really the new world, is looking at identity as being the prime factor for an entry point for would-be attackers, really.
All right, thanks for that, Anton. So compromised identities are one of the most common attack paths. In modern environments, what happens when credentials are compromised, when someone's password is stolen, for example?
Password theft is just one thing. You have to understand why that password has been stolen in the first place. There's probably already some information about that user on the various different things like I know we use the dark web as a blanket term now, but on various different forums and databases or whatnot for would-be attackers to start leveraging. So there could be anything from just simple credential theft to actually building out a persona of what an attacker would need to then actually impersonate that individual and get into the business and effectively cause absolute havoc, whether it be financial or damaging to internal infrastructure.
That is crazy to think about, that it's not just about gaining access into a system, but also creating this digital identity, right? Because you have to be mindful of what kind of information you have out there about yourself as well, and the access that someone can get just from getting a password.
Because they're ultimately building a profile, right? They're profiling everybody who they're trying to attack. So they understand from looking at LinkedIn that I'm a senior solutions engineer, so they're going to do things to then impersonate me in certain ways and build out what I might behave like, to then utilize that to get further into the business by communicating to my peers as if they're me, all sorts of stuff, if they can bypass some of our levels of security.
Wow.
In our case, we have a lot of things within Babbel that we do to facilitate securing that, but, you know, live what we preach, you know. So ultimately, we want to be sharing that with our customers, that they can also have secure environments in the same way.
Exactly, because in speaking to that, of course, that would be expected from a tech company, right? But the average small business doesn't go to the same extremes as a tech business would. So I love that emphasis on just disseminating best practices to our customers
Yeah,
as well.
absolutely.
Yeah. So moving on, why is credential theft now the primary attack method for smaller businesses?
The easiest way to get into a business is playing to somebody's weaknesses. And by doing something that you can manipulate them to giving away information without them even knowing that they're doing so is the quickest way to get into an environment.
Yeah, I mean, it's literally psychological warfare at this
Yeah,
point in time, and
absolutely.
the threats aren't always that obvious. It's not always someone asking you for a password or for some kind of, credential that allows them to gain access into whatever platform, but it could be click on this link, it could be scan this QR code. They're getting a lot more savvy and just smart because they have the luxury of just watching human behavior and just knowing what the weak points are, as you had already touched on. So, yeah, definitely scary stuff, but it's all, part of the game. And that's exactly why we're having these
Yeah.
kinds of conversations in the first place,
Yeah, and
right?
you catch me smiling. It's not a funny topic, but it's,
Yeah,
it's something that I think the reason I'm
yeah.
saying that is because it's something we can all relate to. Even the IT savvy, things catch us out.
All right. So, switching gears to now where these gaps in identity management typically exist, right? So, starting off with password only access, Anton, why is that still a common security gap in smaller organizations?
It's convenience, but also it's to do with education, I guess, and not really having the right resource to educate people on behaviors. And what I mean by that is, people will go down password stuff because they don't want to necessarily encourage people, or they're concerned about having kickback around adding multi-factor authentication. Because let's face it, again, humans, we want to do things the most efficient and quickest way possible. We don't want something else that's going to slow us down in our job to get things done. But having to log onto a system and then you're being prompted for another notification to then allow it to sign in is frustrating. However, if you'd have a bit of education around it as to the reasons why you might have that, because it protects yourself as a business and it protects the end user, then all of a sudden it's a different type of conversations.
And it makes sense, right? I mean, even outside of the work setting, we just live in a instant gratification era, if you will. So especially when you're chasing tight deadlines and all of that, the last thing you need is to log in on this device and scan your face and all the rest of it. But
Yeah.
like at the end of the day, these measures are put in place not to frustrate you, but to actually keep you protected as well. All right. So now moving on to excessive privilege, right? That's a little bit of a mouthful. So how dangerous is over provisioned admin access in reality?
Extremely dangerous. Admin roles should be really analysed and distributed with the utmost of care. It quite often isn't, and I'll touch on that. But, if somebody with too much access or elevated access gets compromised because they're not even aware of the level of access that they have, then the knock-on effect that has to your environment, your business data, your solutions, your products that you're utilizing or consuming to do your everyday work is all of a sudden a big issue. We see this a lot in SaaS platforms or software as a service solutions or platform as a service because, people just want to get up and running really quickly. And so they just go, right, this is a little bit complicated. They may not be educated on the platform properly. So they'll just give everybody elevated rights. So everyone can just log in and do whatever they want. The problem with that is internally, an end user might be malicious. We hope not. They might make a mistake and not own up to it. But furthermore, they might get compromised and that person has full access to the domain or full access to this particular platform that has company data in it and stuff. So, it's excessive privilege is a big issue. A lot of housekeeping should be done and it should be taken very seriously.
And, as you were speaking, I was thinking about how everyone in an organization is essentially a target, right?
Yeah.
So maybe those malicious actors are counting on everybody having admin access in a small business, right? So they don't
Yeah,
necessarily
absolutely.
need to target the business owner or the CFO or CTO, depending on how big your company is. But basically, they don't have to target leadership necessarily because they could essentially target someone that's a little bit low on the food chain, if you will, hierarchy, and then they can get access to the crown jewels just from accessing their
Oh,
account alone.
yeah, you're bang on.
Yeah.
Like it's in the same way that, cyber criminals will operate in the same way as penetration testers. And this is why You'll have organizations that will go out and do penetration testing in the same way. The easiest way for me to explain it is doing a if that, then there kind of approach. So they'll come in at low level with nothing, and they'll try their access. And then if they can't get access, they'll do things to elevate it into other areas. And they'll do the same with end users. So just because an end user might be, I don't know, a receptionist or somebody who's got very minimal access to the systems, doesn't necessarily mean that they do only have minimal access to the system. So they might access the receptionist's environment or the
Yeah.
receptionist account, do a bit of testing and realize actually, like you said, they don't have to go to the CEO or CTO or domain admin because somebody's gone and given the receptionist the wrong level of access. However, if it is secured, then they might do something to mimic the receptionist to go speak to somebody else to then work out how they can impersonate themselves up the food chain.
Yeah. Either way, you don't want your account to be compromised, whether you have access to that data or not, is basically the take home there. But just going back to something that you had just said around penetration testing, what is that exactly, Anton?
Ethical hacking is probably the old term for it.
Oh,
Ultimately, you're trying to go in there with nothing, as if you're a would-be attacker, to look at vulnerabilities and ways and document every step of the process that you're going through to uncover risks, vulnerabilities, open doors that can be brute forced, all these other things, and effectively present that to an organization to say, right, well, these are all your elements that I've exposed, and these are my recommendations that you need to do to close them off.
okay. All right. Nice. Thank you for that
No, it's all
clarification.
right.
Just wanted to make sure I was on the same page. All
Yeah.
right. So another common, security gap in identity management is lifecycle control. So Anton, what happens when joiners, movers, and leavers of the company aren't tightly governed?
Yeah, so that goes back to what I was saying earlier around housekeeping. So we were talking about housekeeping about roles, but it's housekeeping around leavers, joiners, and things like that. If there's no governance in place for it, you're not knowing what's going on, then again, there's a risk. For example, somebody might leave the organization if their account hasn't been suspended or shut down or deleted, depending on what your policies are. Ultimately, you're still at risk as an organization. As an example, that end user might leave and go to another business and get hacked from that other business. So if they're being attacked or compromised at that other business, but then there's a history, and if you tie that back down to LinkedIn, because a lot of people have their profiles on business social media like LinkedIn, we go, oh, well, now this person's working for company A and we've breached, and we'll try those credentials for company B where they worked for before. Oh, look, we can still get in because that account's not been terminated. And then again, wreak havoc. Housekeeping is really, really important. You've got to make sure that roles, privileges, everything else are associated in the right way. If somebody leaves, there needs to be a process about offboarding them. And in the same way, if you're onboarding them, you need to do it in a structured manner that you have an understanding of what permissions you're giving them and what roles you're giving them from the offset. So it's easier to manage. Because if you have that in place, it's sustainable and repeatable. And if these things are sustainable and repeatable, you can ensure there's a level of security and process behind it.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Wow, a lot going on there. It's just crazy to think how these, hackers are essentially virtually stalking us, just
Yeah,
tracking
we're being
engagement
hunted.
online and
We are the prey.
literally. But I mean, it's all interesting how, as you had said earlier, all of this ties in to each other, right? Because we're talking about identity management, managing that digital identity, but then we've also been interweaving human risk because that ties into the behavior side of things. And then also in managing that identity, we talk about managing those devices. So the devices that those people are using, which we'll be discussing in an upcoming episode. So now switching gears to, if you had to define the non-negotiables for SMB identity security, what are they?
So non-negotiables for S&B security, I would say MFA should be on everyone, absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt. It's everyone's responsibility. Multi-factor authentication is probably the easiest one to go for. But yeah, because everyone's a target, right? As we mentioned earlier, like it's no longer a scenario whereby you only need to protect the top 1% of your business. It's everyone, because we can be impersonated, and we trust the people we work with. So that's the primary one. And then depending on your environment, I'm talking from what we're familiar with and what we utilize internally. We use Microsoft, we're a Microsoft partner. But if you are in a Microsoft house, I would recommend conditional access, because where you might have challenges, and going back to what I was saying before, when I was mentioning around convenience and an adoption of these things like multi-factor authentication, conditional access could be really useful, because actually it might mean that when you're connected to the office Wi-Fi or office infrastructure or internal network, you don't need MFA because it knows you're in a trusted building. But if you're using applications or you're external to the internal infrastructure, then it will actually invoke MFA because it knows that you're in an area that is not necessarily to be trusted. And so it means that anybody who's connecting externally, even if your account is being compromised, it should invoke the MFA solution to then protect you, so you get notifications or people can't get in.
Just to quickly pause on conditional access. So basically, if my phone had to get stolen, touch wood, and it winds up in somewhere random like Indonesia, I'm in South Africa, and let's say they take my phone and they have their hands on my password, they wouldn't be able to access any of my files, even if they do have my password, because they're logging in from Indonesia. And the system is like, wait,
In effect,
Lynn wouldn't
yes.
be in Indonesia. Okay, yeah, depending on the
in effect,
settings
yeah.
that you...
Now, there are nuances to it, because sometimes people will have their MFA tokens on their phones. And this is my own personal opinion. I try and advocate from keeping devices separate. So if you know, if I'm accessing email on one device, then I need to be having my MFA system on another one. But then also, this is where the kind of thought process is around zero trust networks and things like that, is actually, you know what, if it's not on there, it's not, you know, maybe even MFA doesn't get invoked. It just doesn't allow it, depending on where it is or the geographic location. So there's all sorts of things you can do about it. I'll probably go into full nerd mode if I continue.
We'll have a whole episode on conditional access alone.
Yeah. So
Okay.
we'll park it there. But another one would be the privileged access management element of things as well. So looking at things around elevating the way that people have access. So what I mean by that is, my privileged access management will only give people access for that period of time when they need it, and then it'll drop it down. So if there's elements whereby somebody needs to access something for a period of time, then it's only elevated for that short period, or after that, there's no longer access. So if that account gets compromised, they're no longer at this level, they're at this level. So everything is tiered. So you always have a baseline, and you can't do anything more than that unless you request permission for it.
Okay. So we've briefly spoken about privileged access management before, and you've described it as a double-edged sword. Do you mind unpacking what you meant by that?
Yeah, so privileged access management is great, right? Because we want to ensure that people only have access to things as and when they need to, as opposed to all the time. So if I'm a global admin and I've got global admin permissions all the time, then it means that at any time somebody breaches my account, they can get in and cause all sorts of chaos. So really, if I'm only getting elevated access at those periods of time, then I'm protected as an organization generally, because actually when somebody does breach my account, I say when, if somebody does breach my account, I can't get the elevated access. The challenge then becomes that it moves the goalpost to the admins of the privileged access management system. So therefore, actually, whilst it's a great utility to have, what you then need to do is make sure that you're ultimately protecting the privileged access management system with even more rigor, because if somebody gets into that, then they can start elevating permissions to wherever they need.
Okay, now I see what you meant by that. Thanks for that, Anton. All right, so in summary, we have multi-factor authentication, conditional access, and privileged access management as, the non-negotiables for SMB identity security. So now moving on to governance and ownership, because sometimes this can be where things get a little bit murky, especially when we're talking about identity management, right? Who should actually own identity in the average small business? Is it IT, HR, security, leadership, or E, all of the above?
Well, I think just kind of answered it with the last one, but that is because there's not a simple answer. It's with its own nuances, but everybody ultimately should be responsible for their own identity. However, the organization needs to be putting things in place to help define what that structure looks like and give people the tools to be able to own that piece for themselves. Ultimately, yes, it might be mine or your responsibility, but how do we then do that,
What does that actually mean? Okay, that makes sense. All right, so even that receptionist that you mentioned earlier on, she's also responsible for identity, at least her own.
Yeah,
All
exactly.
right.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So then, how often should access be formally reviewed?
Yeah, and I'm glad you put emphasis on the word formally, because in the ideal world, you'd like to think that access should be reviewed on real time, but the reality is that's not always possible. But at the very least, I would say annually. But I'd urge people to fall more in line with frameworks and review it on a quarterly basis, and with the addition of proactive monitoring. So, with me saying around real time, again, we don't necessarily have the capabilities individuals to monitor everything. But if we've got solutions in place to actually provide some real-time monitoring that will alert us when there is a challenge or a problem or things like that, then that's at the benefit to the organization. But I would say very least yearly, but to fall in line with certain frameworks that an organization might belong to, or if you're doing things like, I don't know, I'm going to throw out acronyms here, but SOC 2, Type 2 accreditation and things like that, or you're following the guidelines from NIST if you need to, then you might want to be looking at that quarterly.
So now speaking to this review process, what metrics actually matter the most in identity security?
That's a good question. I had an analogy for it. A clean house will always expose when something is dirty, right? What I mean by that is basically keeping a clear view of and a document of any unused accounts, reducing the amount of accounts that have elevated access. So going back to what we were talking about earlier around the elevated rights or various roles-based stuff that we might not have taken visibility of properly because we just needed to get things done. Well, actually, if you do a bit of housekeeping and keep everything tidy, then when something bad comes in, you're more likely to be able to see it. So that's why I was using that analogy of a clean house will always expose when something's dirty. If I've got clean carpets or a clean floor down in my kitchen, I'll know when a speck of dirt lands on it. But if it's already dirty, then I don't know what the dirt, whether how much more dirt's been added to it until it gets ridiculous.
I love an analogy because it makes that abstract concept that much more tangible and relatable, right? So in closing, Anton, this might be a little bit of a hard question to answer, but I will ask you anyway. What would you say is a quick win that a listener or viewer can take back to the office to protect their organization's passwords?
A quick win would be to look at passwords in a different way. I did a CREST certification course a while back, and it actually changed the way that I thought of passwords altogether. And it's actually using what we refer to as passphrases. So they're in the same way as passwords, but passphrases, I think, are a little bit more obtainable because when you talk to end users about passwords and you say, "Oh, right, yeah, you need a 8-character alphanumeric password with a special character in there and everything else." And people are stuck trying to think about what are they going to put in their passwords, because then you're told you shouldn't think about anything that is relating to you. You've got no friends and families, no birthdays, nothing about Christmas, all these other things. So you're having a bit of a mind melt. And then the negative aspect of that is that what people will do is then they'll think of a password, and then they'll utilize that password on everything because it's complicated, and then they get stuck with it. So they're like, well, I can't think of 5 different complicated passwords, and some businesses don't allow you to use a password keeper or anything like that. And then when the 90 days are up, they'll change the number and a digit ever so slightly, and that's it. So that's the problem with passwords. Passphrases actually changes the narrative mentally. So you can look at it being like multiple words, but because it's a phrase, like you can think of it like song lyrics. The more that you repeat that to yourself internally in your brain, the more that you're going to remember it. So you could have something like sausage, cheese, Frankfurter foot, just making it up, but with hyphens in between and a couple of capital letters. And all of a sudden, that is a 25-character password. Now, 25-character password is a hard thing to break. And the likeliness is because these words are all different, it's something that somebody can't necessarily breach very easily. However, from your perspective, because it's so random, it's something that you probably remember. So when you're thinking of phrases, it's something that you can reprogram in your brain to then use, and then you can use another one for something else, because phrases are much more easier to remember than passwords. If you look at these password generators when you go onto a website, when you're creating a new account, it'd be like hashtag, then the star sign, 45, capital C, lowercase v, capital M, hyphen, GW. And you're like, how am I going to remember that? You're not. So then you need a password keeper and you're saving it. But then if somebody breaches your password keeper, then they've got access to all your stuff. So I know I've gone off on a tangent. I really apologize. To make things a little bit more secure outside of the world of MFA is to go down the passphrase route. But MFA should be turned on for everyone unless conditional access is enabled.
All right. So I couldn't think of a better note to end this on. Is there anything else that you would add in terms of identity management that we haven't covered?
If there's any of this stuff that resonates and you want to talk about, you can speak to us and we'll guide you along that journey.
Perfect. I've definitely learned a few things talking to you today. So thank you again for joining us, Anton.
No worries. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
All right. Always a pleasure. That's a wrap on today's episode of the Hidden Podcast. If this episode gave you an aha moment that helped you untangle something that's been bugging you, subscribe and share it with a friend who's in the same boat. And if you're wondering where you stand across the 6 hidden layers, try our cybersecurity snapshot in the description below. It's a lot less painful than a breach. Until next time, don't let your risks stay hidden.